Hi, in this video, we'll do a walkthrough of inputs and data processing within DataForge. So we start within our DataForge environment or our workspace here, and I'm looking at this interactive demos project. I've got a number of different sources already set up. For this example, I'm going to open the sales order detail, which is a table source. It pulls from SQL Server, as you can see. And I've already actually got a few different inputs created on this source. And you'll notice every time you open a source, the default tab that opens is the inputs, and that's because the majority of the time when you're working with a source, after you've kind of done that initial setup, most of the time you're going to be working with the inputs in one fashion or another, or navigating to another place from these inputs. And so if we take a look at each of our inputs here, we notice that DataForge tracks a set of metadata for every separate input. And this really represents a separate batch of data in this instance. So when we're looking at our source settings, the source could be either batch or stream processing. In this case, it's batch. So each one of these inputs or rows here within the table represents a separate batch of data that we've pulled from SQL Server into DataForge and are now storing it within Databricks and in AWS in this case. So looking at this metadata, we can see that there are a few different things that stand out. We've got an ID, so every input will have a unique ID across all your sources, all your projects within your workspace. You will have the date time that it was actually received. And so for table sources, this is basically going to tell you what time was this input created and when did it start processing the data. For file sources, which we'll take a look at an example in this video, this actually represents the time that the file was last modified. So we can see a compressed size of the batch of data. We see a total record count. So we've actually pulled the same record count for both of these inputs, one after the other. And then we can actually see the effective record count. And so this is something that you'll get really familiar with as you have sources that are, say, key refresh, where you're actually looking at maybe a more limited number of effective records for every input that you pull, depending on how much the data is changing from pull to pull. If you click on the record count hyperlink here, you'll actually get more details around the effective records that were created or processed as part of this input. So clicking out of that, we can then see the status of the input. And so we can, we'll get into this in a little bit, but we can see the overall status of the processing for that input. So for example, if there was a failure here, we can take a look at what happened within the processes and take action on that. While the inputs are running, we'll see the current process type and the last completed process type get updated here so that we have a good idea of what's happening as it's happening. And then we also have these menu options. So as you start to work with DataForge and inputs in particular, you may run into situations where you need to either recalculate certain inputs or you need to reset certain processes that may have failed. What you'll find here is that there is an individual menu for every input. So you can see that here on each row, and they'll have certain options available to you, and DataForge will kind of lock you in to make sure that you don't modify the data in a way that kind of breaks the data, if you will. So we don't have to worry about that at all. DataForge is really going to limit the processes that you can do to make sure things stay well maintained and the data is good. So if we look at the menu options here, the top options are almost always going to be reset a certain process within the processing chain. Below, we'll have some options for deleting an input, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, what you may or may not want to do with deletes and what happens when you click the delete. And then we've got options for viewing the data, and we have an option for viewing the raw schema. So just, viewing data, obviously very familiar. You just want to look at the data that is relevant to this input. And then viewing the raw schema, you can actually see a filtered down version of what the schema was for that input at the time that it was ingested and processed. So you'll notice it's filtered down on that input ID versus the total schema that may or may not be different from other inputs. The last thing here is the actual header level menu. So you will have those menus on every input like we talked about. That said, you may even need to reset processing wider than just one input, or you may need to take more of a bulk action here. So for example, if you needed to reset all change data capture processes, or you needed to reset a full output to rerun all of the inputs within the source and to that output. A very common one would be recalculating data. So as you're adding new rules, you may want to recalculate all inputs for the source rather than just specific ones, so that you know that that rule it will exist on every record and give you a result. Another option here, similar to the individual input delete, is the delete source data. So this will essentially kind of wipe out the source. So you want to be careful with this one, but it can be helpful if you need to kind of restart on a source, for example, or reload an entire data set. Now the next view, the delete source metadata, this is a little bit more infrequently used. So as you're deleting specific inputs, one thing is DataForge will continue to evolve the raw schema of the source. So for example, if I had a certain attribute that only was brought in on this first input, and I saw it in my raw schema, if I delete this first input, because that field doesn't exist on any other inputs that have been brought in, we'll actually delete that field from the raw schema too, just essentially cleaning it up and keeping the raw schema tied to what is actually exists within the inputs. And then the last few options here, so we've got a pull data now. So if you needed to essentially start a manual pull of the data, you'll notice that there are two options here. There's one in this header level menu, and then there is also just a standout button here for pull now. So again, that's meant for just kicking off a manual ingestion of data. And then the last two options here, so view source data, you can click this, and this will actually open up the table within Databricks. So if you needed to run a query or actually look at your data, this is an easy way to get to the table. And then from here, it looks like we're starting up some compute. But from here, you would be able to create a new notebook or a new query to actually look at the data, or maybe you want to look at the sample data that's available in here. So if we go back to our inputs tab. The last option that you'll find is just basically for ease of navigation, you can actually open any of the outputs that this source is tied to from the inputs tab. So now what we'll do is actually kick off a new input. So I'll do a pull now. And we'll see how this works. And we're going to actually dive into more of the processing side of this, which make up really what an input is. So we can see that it's in progress in that status bar. We can actually click on that status to open the process chain here that's happening. So we can see that it's currently running enrichment, and it will continue to run through the standard processing chain. While we wait for this to run, just a couple of visual or UI elements here. So every process will, again, similar to input IDs, have a unique process ID, and that's through the whole workspace. If you needed to share a process, for example, you wanted to have someone else look at a specific process, you can click on the process ID to get a hyperlink and copy that out. And then if you share this with anyone, they'll get brought to exactly this location with this process record expanded. The next thing is the timeline. So won't spend a ton of time here, but you can kind of quickly get it. But the only thing to call out here is that the white boxes are actually, we'll call them load times or wait times. So for example, if I didn't have a cluster up and running and Databricks already ready to go, what we would see here is we would have a little bit longer of a wait time while that cluster actually gets up and starts running. And then the blue time is actually the DataForge processing time, right? So it's the time that we're managing the data before the cluster gets shut down or reused elsewhere, or we move on to the next process. In the operation, this is really going to show you within the processing chain which process type was this specific record. So we notice that each record in this table is a different process that we're running. The job run ID, we'll actually spend more time on this in a little bit when we look at the overall processing, but just know that this is actually the job run that is running within Databricks. And then we've got the status of each process, so we can see that this whole processing chain was successful. The next metric is the record count. So this is really helpful, kind of quick identifier. So we can see that after ingestion was actually run, within each process, we've got essentially the same record counts. So we've got this 121,000 records. Enrichment, we can see that there were 0. So nothing got calculated. And then we've got some views, but we can see that one of the outputs did actually run and output all 121,000 records. So again, just a really helpful kind of quick identifier. Now the next two, again, we'll spend a little bit more time on the logging side of this, but really you can find logs for every individual process here, and then you can find process parameters for every individual process. So there's a ton of information, a ton of data available to you. Now, obviously, the important thing is really understanding what you're looking at and how to use it. So if we just take a step back here before we kind of move into some of those nice to haves and digging into the observability side of it, if we look at the standard processing chain, every input that you pull, if it's a batch process, for example, on your source settings, it's going to go through the same set of processes that DataForge will essentially orchestrate and run for you. So if we look at this as kind of that default example, when we create a new input, the first thing that the input is going to do, or that DataForge is going to do, is it's actually going to go and grab the data from your source system. So it's going to ingest the data from your source system into DataForge into your data lake. The next process that will run after ingestion is capture data changes. So now that we've landed the data, what we're going to do is we're going to essentially compare that new data set, that new batch of data, with our existing hub table. And we're going to tag every record from that new batch of data, whether it's new, changed, unchanged, so that we know how to effectively update the hub table. And so this capture data changes will vary depending on the refresh type that you have set within your source settings. Now, enrichment is essentially calculating all your rules. So specifically, enrichment will capture any rules that are snapshot type rules. Anything that's a keep current we'll get to, but essentially this enrichment is going to calculate all those rules on any of the effective records, and then it will attach those enriched rules or those enriched columns and those records to the hub table. And so the refresh, that's the next step. That's essentially us saying, okay, we've recalculated, we've calculated all the rules on this new set of records. Now for refresh, what we want to do is we actually want to update the hub table with those effective records. And so refresh is really all meant to be updating the hub table. And then to the same extent, if we have keep current rules in here in our rule settings, which we'll learn about more in this training, the keep currents are going to be calculated within refresh and attribute recalculation. So that's another step that we don't see in this process currently. But if we have a rule that points to another source and the rule is set to keep current, anytime that other source gets new data, we need to recalculate this source to make sure that it is up to date and is current. So what we'll see is if we have that type of situation between refresh and any optional outputs, we'll have that attribute recalculation process in here as well. Now, the next process that we have in here is output, and we can actually see that there are 3 different processes for output listed here. And that's specifically because I have this one source hooked up to 3 different outputs. So every time each individual output runs, we get a unique process record in this table. And the output process is really meant to essentially, you're publishing the data to another system, whether it be to Databricks itself, or you're sending it to a file format, or you're sending it out to another database, another API, whatever whatever use case you might have. That's really what the output process is. It's saying, okay, now that we have that updated hub table, we have the refresh data in our hub table, everything's accurate, everything's current. Now we can publish and write that data out to another system. And so that's what output is. And the last process that you'll see in here is data profile. And that is an optional process that you can choose to run or not on your sources. And data profile is really helpful while you're developing. There are many different use cases for it, but if you just really needed a quick glance at a profile of every column of the data within this source, you can do it. So when you run data profile, you'll get an actual profile on every column in your raw schema. You'll get a profile on all your rules. And that is an optional parameter that is decided in the source settings. Specifically within the performance and cost, you can manage whether that runs or not with this disable profiling flag. So if we go back to our processes view, one thing you'll notice here is when I navigate from the status of an input, the processes are essentially filtered down to just that inputs processes. However, if I open processing from any other page or clear that filter out, I can actually see all the processes that are run on this source. And again, I can start to filter it down. So if we take a look lastly at a file source, there's just some slightly different processing that happens for files. And so I want to give you an example of that. So if we again click on our input status, we'll see the process record. We can expand this. Now, what's different about file sources is that we actually have a parse process as well. And so again, this is one example of where DataForge is really going to choose for you what types of processes do you need to run to keep your data up to date and accurate. And so for files, similar to how we handle tables, we'll ingest the file. So maybe it's coming from S3 or Azure storage. But we're going to grab that file from the original location. We'll move it into the data lake so that we've got a copy to work with. And then the next process, which is parse, is basically reading that file copy that was moved. For the file, we're going to get the schema from that file in this parse process, and then we're going to standardize the file format, right? So maybe you brought it in as a CSV or a JSON file. This is essentially where that ends, and now we're going to work with standardized file formats now that we're in DataForge. And then from there, you can see again that standard processing chain where we then go back to capture data changes. We run enrichment to run our rule calculations. We run refresh to update the hub table. And then lastly, we do some data profiling so that we have a good idea of what we're working with. Okay, so let's look at what happens if a process fails, right? Because things aren't always going to go perfectly. We need to know how to adapt to that situation. So let's take a look at another source. We go to our sources tab here. I've got another version of sales order detail that's got a failure here. So the first input that we did, we can see that that input failed, and it failed while running the capture data changes process. And so we can confirm that if we click on the status, and then we expand that process record. Again, we can see in here, we've got the ingestion that was successful. And then once we started capture data changes, we can see that that had failed. What we can do is actually check our logs just to make sure that we've got that, maybe it was a fluke in some compute, or maybe there's an actual problem that we need to address with our setup. So the first thing that we would do is check the logs here. And we can see that we were waiting for a cluster, we started running, and then the job run terminated or failed to launch, right? So maybe what we need to do instead is check the Databricks logs, which are a little bit more verbose in terms of when there's an issue with compute or infrastructure. And so we can see that this job was actually canceled by somebody, right? So silly us. Job got canceled. Basically, all we need to do is then reset the process for that input so that it can continue to, go through CDC successfully and then continue through that standard processing chain. So how we would do that is go to inputs, and then, like we talked about earlier, we basically have two options. One is on the input level for the menus, or we have the top level menu here. So if we went to the input level, I would basically come in here and say, I want to reset CDC because that's what's failed, right? And if this had failed on enrichment, then I would come in here and reset enrichment. Or if it was output, I'd reset output. And so you kind of get the gist. But how this works is essentially when you reset an individual process, DataForge will then essentially finish from that process to the end, right? And so if you reset CDC, it'll then also run enrichment and output, et cetera. So it's not just going to reset the one individual process. It'll essentially reset at that point in the processing chain. And so another way that we could do this is if we open the top level record here, if you weren't totally sure on, which process do I need to reset, you can always use this generic retry failed process option, and that will actually show you if you hover over it which process type is going to be retried. So if we just go in here, we're going to just reset CDC. And then, once this is completed and successful, then we don't have to worry about this anymore. But that's how you would fix a failed process or a failed input if you need to. And we can see that that manual reset capture data changes was successful, and now we're on to enrichment. So since we started talking about the different types of troubleshooting methods and logs that you have available to you, we'll just take a minute to actually look at the other pieces of DataForge that you can dig into. So we looked at the processing tab here. We took a look a little bit at the logs, and again, these are all the detailed logs that we can find in here. We can also look through the Databricks job run page in here. And so we won't spend a ton of time on here. Obviously, there's a lot of Databricks documentation out there where you can troubleshoot and kind of learn how to use their interface. That said, the majority of our logs are going to be posted here during that whole cluster runtime. And then just some other helpful hints here. So the Spark UI is really going to help you identify, is the cluster right-sized, right? So is it big enough? Is it small enough for the data and the processing that we need to do? The logs will be helpful for actually digging through job logs to understand what errored out and when did it error. And then lastly, the metrics will just give you a good understanding of how that cluster is running performance-wise, right, with the number of workers that it has or the driver that it has. And so again, it'll just kind of help you right-size the jobs that you have, or more fine-tuning, if you will. But again, so you can access all these Databricks logs directly from the DataForge UI in addition to our logs here. And then if we needed to, we can also go to the overall processing page. So we looked at an individual source process tab. However, we also have this main processing page available as well. So if we click on that, we can actually see all these different processes that we've been running in this video and beforehand. So we can expand any of those processes, and this is across this whole project. You can actually access all that same information from the individual source process, or if you were looking at the output on the processing tab, same thing. You can access all that same information from this page. And you'll see that in the processing queue. And so this is really the kind of go-to for if you're looking for checking on individual processes or details behind those processes. Another helpful page can be the job runs. And so if we open this up, you can actually see all the different job runs that DataForge has launched within your Databricks instance. And so we can actually see the run IDs. So you can open these up. This will actually open the Databricks job run page directly within their UI. We can see the actual cluster configurations that were used. We can see the job ID that was used. And then we can see some helpful information on actual run times for clusters. So when was it launched? When did it start processing? When did it stop processing? And then we would be able to see, currently running sources and processes if I had anything running at this time. Another way to access this, just for ease of use. So if you were on a processing page, when we looked at that job run ID, we were able to open the Databricks page. We can also directly open the job run page from that same hyperlink, and it'll be filtered down for the job run that was tied to that process. So again, you can kind of quickly narrow down on what you need to see in here. So we'll clear out that filter. Now the other two processing pages in here, if you, for example, did have jobs that were queued waiting for other processes to run. So for example, if you had multiple inputs running on the same source at the same time, you might see some inputs or processes being queued. And those queues are all listed in this workflow queue here. And so you would actually be able to see what are the different wait types, why is it waiting, what is it waiting for, and then this would be refreshed, right, as processes complete or as queues are kind of successfully skipped past. And the last page that we'll look at here is the ingestion queue. And so this is just a really helpful page for seeing what's up and coming. And this is specifically focused on ingestions, where the processing queue was kind of in totality looking at all the processes for each source. The ingestion queue will show you what ingestions are actually scheduled or queued coming up. In addition, you can also look at details around jobs that are already complete. So ingestions that have successfully completed or failed to complete. The last thing that I want to show you in this video is the actual structured data lake that you'll get in your data storage from DataForge. So if we just take again another look at one specific example source, so we'll use this sales order detail. And if we actually looked at the sources page, or we can look in the hyperlink here, we can see that the source ID is 165. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to jump over to AWS S3. And we're actually looking at the data lake kind of behind all these DataForge sources. And so every data lake is going to be structured the same. It's just how many sources you have, how many inputs you have will dictate how many files you have within the data lake. And so if we're actually looking at our data lake here, we can see a couple manual file or folders that I actually set up. So we've got an inbox. This is typically where I drop files to ingest into different sources. We've got an archive folder, again, where we may be archiving original copies of files as we're working with them and then deleting them. And then we can actually see individual folders for each source. And so if we looked at that source 165, we can search for that in here. And we can see that folder for source 165. And then within each source folder or directory, if you will, you're going to have subfolders in here for each process type, and you'll have one for the hub table. So if we look at this, for example, because this was a table source, the first thing that we have available to us is the parsed files. And this is essentially representing what data was ingested. And so you can see one folder for each input ID. Let me go back to our input here. And we've deleted a couple of them, but I can see for input 2715, that actually exists right here in this folder here. So we can actually see the Parquet files that exist for that process, for that specific input, for that specific source. So we go back to our source folder, that's parsed. Then you would actually be able to also look at CDC, and these all follow the same structure. So you would have the process type, then the input ID, and then the actual files that make up that inputs process. So again, 2715, we can see the Parquet files that make up that CDC result. And then same thing for enrichment. We got each individual input. And then the hub folder is the only thing that is slightly different. And this again depends on the refresh type for your source. But what actually happens is there's going to be a current and a history folder. So for example, if you had like key refresh, you would be able to look at the hub history at any point in time for any input. And so that would be in your hub history. And then you've got your current. And basically the hub table, when you query it in Databricks or you're looking at your sample data, so DataForge will know and understand which pieces of these two folders should we join so that you can actually see the hub table. And so that is essentially the data lake and how you might look at it. Now, obviously, you shouldn't actually change any of the files manually in your data lake. Everything should be maintained and managed by DataForge, and you should be making changes through the DataForge UI to really drive changes in these. But if you did need to actually look at some of these specific files, you can always query and actually read these Parquet files, even just using Databricks like a notebook to read these Parquet files to understand what did the data look like at the CDC point, what did it look like in enrichment, and then finally what does it look like in the hub table, right? And so it just helps you troubleshoot and kind of backtrack your processing, if you will. So let's jump back to DataForge, and just to summarize, the inputs is primarily a batch of data or a stream of data. So when you're looking at a source, you'll have potentially many different inputs in here. Each input is made up of a set of data and then a set of processes that DataForge has run to make that data accurate and available within the hub table. Each source, the hub table, is essentially all of the inputs combined for whatever the effective records are across all those inputs. If you needed to access the processes behind an input, you can click on the status or go to the processes page. You can also go to the generic processing tab here to kind of see a wider view of everything that's happened within your workspace. So that's everything about inputs and processing. Hopefully this helps. Thanks.